When my son married, I never told anyone that my late wife had left me her ranch. Keeping it secret turned out to be wise because exactly 1 week later, my daughter-in-law arrived at my house with a notary. But the moment she finally learned the truth, her predatory smile vanished forever. I am Richard, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful retired structural engineer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Tuesday, they invited themselves over to catch up. Between fake smiles and legal documents, my daughter-in-law leaned forward, smirking. "You know, Richard, you are lucky we even include you in our plans. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my water and smiled. That night I logged in, reviewed my hidden cameras, and emailed my lawyer about securing the ranch. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the rugged outskirts of Colorado meant learning how to survive harsh winters and rely on yourself. But inside my sprawling, quiet suburban home, a different kind of coldness had recently permeated every corner. My house, with its sturdy brick walls and carefully manicured lawn, was supposed to be a sanctuary after my beloved wife Carolyn passed away 8 months ago. Instead, it became the staging ground for a silent, calculated coup. The afternoon sun was casting long, harsh shadows across my living room floor when the doorbell rang. I remember the smell of brewing coffee filling the kitchen, a quiet comfort I had relied on to break the deafening silence Carolyn left behind. I opened the heavy oak door to find my 35-year-old son, Brad, standing on the porch. Beside him was his new wife of exactly 1 week, Victoria. She was 32, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, looking every bit the ruthless, high-end real estate broker she was. And standing slightly behind them was a man I did not recognize. He had slicked back dark hair, a cheap gray suit, and a worn leather briefcase clutched tightly in his sweaty hand. Victoria pushed past me into the foyer, bringing a wave of suffocating, overly sweet perfume with her. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly, rehearsed warmth that made my stomach turn. She walked straight into my living room, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and gestured for the stranger to follow her to the coffee table. The man placed his briefcase on my table, snapped the latches open, and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He set them down squarely, followed by a heavy metallic notary stamp that hit the glass with a dull, final thud. Victoria turned to me, flashing a perfectly white, predatory smile. Her eyes, however, remained cold and calculating. "Dad, we need to talk." She began, her tone laced with fake sympathy. "Brad and I have been so incredibly worried about you lately. You have been slipping, forgetting things. You look so tired all the time. We know the grief over losing Carolyn has been heavy, and it is taking a toll on your mind. We just want you to rest. So we had these drawn up." She tapped her manicured fingernail against the top page of the stack. "It is a durable power of attorney. Just sign right here, and I will take over all your financial burdens. I will handle the house, the bills, the accounts. You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again." I slowly shifted my gaze to my son. My boy. The child I had carried on my shoulders, the one I had worked 60-hour weeks to put through college so he could become a credit manager. Brad could not even look me in the eye. He stared stubbornly at his leather loafers, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched in submission. He was entirely complicit in this ambush. He was standing there, letting his new wife strip away my independence in my own home, treating me like an expired liability. I did not argue. I did not yell, and I did not throw them out. As a structural engineer, I spent 40 years looking for stress points, identifying load-bearing walls, and finding the hidden cracks that could bring an entire bridge crashing down. I applied that same logic to human behavior. They looked at me and saw a tired, grieving 70-year-old man. They saw a retired engineer living on a pension, a fragile widower who was losing his grip on reality. They thought I was an easy target, a clueless old fossil who would just roll over and hand over the keys to his kingdom out of sheer exhaustion. But what Victoria did not know, what neither of them knew, was that I was fully aware of what they were actually trying to steal. They were not here out of pity. They were not here to help me pay my utility bills. They were hunting for something much, much bigger. I let my shoulders slump forward, mimicking the exact defeated posture they expected from a broken man. I walked slowly toward the coffee table, letting my hands develop a visible, violent tremor. I reached for the glass of water resting near the legal papers, and with calculated, deliberate clumsiness, I knocked it over. The water spilled rapidly across the glass tabletop, soaking the edges of the blank documents, and narrowly missing the heavy notary stamp. Victoria gasped, her mask of sweet concern slipping for just a fraction of a second as she frantically pulled the papers away from the growing puddle. "Oh, Dad, be careful," she scolded, her voice tight with suppressed frustration and genuine panic. "See, this is exactly what I mean. Your motor skills are deteriorating. You are confused. You need us to step in before you hurt yourself or make a terrible financial mistake." I mumbled a pathetic, breathless apology, pulling a cloth handkerchief from my pocket to dab at the spilled water with shaking hands. "I am sorry, Victoria," I whispered, keeping my eyes wide and deliberately vacant. "I just do not understand. Why do we need a notary here today? Pay my bills on time. Can we not just talk about this like family?" Brad finally spoke, his voice weak and wavering, parroting the lines his wife had clearly fed him on the car ride over. "Dad, it is for the best. Victoria deals with complex contracts and properties all day long. She knows exactly how to protect assets. We just want to make sure you are safe and that nothing gets lost." I looked at my son, feeling a profound, icy hollow form in my chest. He was selling his own father out for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a stepping stone. I knew the devastating legal weight of the document she was holding. A durable power of attorney would give Victoria absolute, unquestionable control over my life. She could empty my bank accounts, sell the roof over my head, dump me in a rundown nursing home, and legally silence me. She was banking on my grief to execute a flawless robbery. But my grief had not made me weak. It had made me hyper-vigilant. "I need to think about this," I said, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound pathetic. "It is a very big step. My head is a little cloudy today. Can you leave the papers here? Let me read them over tonight when I am rested." The fake notary shifted uncomfortably on his feet, avoiding my gaze and looking to Victoria for direction. Victoria's jaw tightened dangerously. She hated losing momentum. She wanted the kill right here, right now. "Dad," she said, her tone dropping an octave, abandoning the fake sweetness. "The notary is already here, and we paid for his time. It is just a simple signature. It will take 2 seconds, and then we can all relax and move forward." "No," I said, letting just a tiny fraction of the old commanding structural engineer bleed into my voice. "I do not sign legal contracts without my reading glasses, and I cannot find them. Come back tomorrow." Victoria stared at me, her eyes narrowing as she searched my face. She was trying to figure out if I was truly confused or if I was playing a game, but my trembling hands and slumped posture convinced her. She let out a long, exaggerated sigh of burden. "Fine. We will come back tomorrow evening. But Dad, please do not make this harder than it has to be. We are doing this for your own good." They turned and walked out, the silent notary following closely behind like a well-paid shadow. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut and their car engine started, my tremors vanished completely. I stood up perfectly straight, rolling my shoulders back. I walked over to the window and watched their vehicle disappear down the street. My hands were rock steady. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the cold, hard reality of the war that had just been declared in my living room. They thought they had cornered a helpless old man. They had no idea they had just awakened a man who knew exactly how to dismantle their lives brick by brick. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and integrity make you family. I spent years believing that providing financial security was enough to earn my son's respect, but true character is revealed only when money is on the line. I learned that ignoring red flags to keep the peace only gives parasites the time they need to sharpen their knives. You cannot buy love, and you cannot fix a weak man's spine. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is having the brutal courage to cut the dead weight loose, protect your legacy, and walk away with your head held high. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for? How did you find the strength to walk away? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories about surviving betrayal and taking back your life. The truth is, this ambush in my living room did not come as a surprise. I knew it was coming. My preparation for this exact moment began exactly 1 week ago on the eve of their lavish wedding. The house had been bustling all day with caterers, florists, and last-minute deliveries. By midnight, the chaos had finally settled. Brad and Victoria were staying in the guest rooms, adhering to some traditional notion of sleeping in separate spaces before the ceremony. I could not sleep. My mind was heavy with memories of Carolyn. We planned to see Brad get married together. We had talked about this milestone for years, saving our money, thus imagining the joy of expanding our family. Without her, the house felt deafening. I got out of bed and decided to prepare my suit for the next morning. I needed my tie clip. Not just any tie clip, but a specific silver one Carolyn had given me on our 20th anniversary. I kept it in a small velvet box in my private ground floor study. I walked down the carpeted hallway in the dark, navigating the familiar layout of my home without needing to turn on the lights. Every floorboard was mapped perfectly in my mind. As I approached the study, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar. A thin, unnatural slice of pale light spilled out onto the hallway floor. It was not the warm, familiar glow of my desk lamp. It was the harsh, erratic beam of a small LED flashlight. I stopped breathing. My bare feet made no sound on the carpet. I edged closer, pressing my back flat against the wall, and peered through the narrow opening. My study was my sanctuary. It held my engineering blueprints, my financial records, and every important document Carolyn and I had accumulated over 40 years of marriage. Victoria was inside. She was fully dressed in black leggings and a dark sweater, kneeling on the hardwood floor in front of my locked metal filing cabinet. The flashlight was clamped securely between her perfect white teeth. In her hands, she held a thin metal tension wrench and a picking tool. I watched in absolute disbelief as my son's future wife skillfully worked the lock of my private cabinet. She twisted her wrist, and I heard the distinct metallic click of the tumbler giving way. She pulled the heavy drawer open. She was not looking for wedding decorations. She was hunting my financial foundation. Before she could dig through my folders, her cell phone buzzed. She placed the lockpicks carefully on the edge of my desk, pulled the phone from her pocket, and answered it. She kept her voice low, a harsh, irritated whisper, but the dead silence of the night carried every single syllable directly to my ears. I listened, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her words. She told the person on the other end of the line that she was absolutely tired of waiting. She complained bitterly about me. She said paying for my existence was a massive drain on their future, speaking of me as if I were a neglected utility bill rather than her future husband's father. Then she laid out her entire plan with terrifying clarity. She told the caller that they just needed to get through the wedding charade tomorrow. She stated her plan to initiate a conservatorship right after the honeymoon. She said I was old, grieving, and entirely vulnerable. Her exact words were that she would liquidate my house within 6 months to cover their hidden debts. She called my home the house Carolyn and I built with decades of sweat, a disposable asset to fix her own financial ruin. The sheer weight of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. I felt a sharp, burning pain in my chest. I had written a check covering 70% of the exorbitant wedding she was going to celebrate in less than 12 hours. I paid for the imported flowers she demanded, the live jazz band she insisted upon, and the premium open bar she claimed was absolutely necessary for her social image. I had drained a significant portion of my liquid savings to give her and my son the perfect day, believing I was welcoming a new daughter into our family. I wanted Brad to be happy. I wanted to give him the celebration his mother would have wanted for him. Instead, I was funding the celebration of a woman who was actively plotting to strip me of my independence, sell the roof over my head, and discard me into some facility the moment the ink on her marriage license dried. I felt a cold, metallic anger replacing my grief. My hands balled into tight fists. I wanted to push the door open, turn on the overhead lights, and throw her out into the cold street right then and there. I wanted to cancel it. My engineering instincts immediately kicked in. As a structural engineer, I spent 40 years calculating load distributions, anticipating stress fractures, and designing safety measures. I knew how to analyze a failing system. Confronting her with no solid proof of the hidden debts she mentioned, and no understanding of the full scope of her criminal plan, would be a catastrophic tactical error. It would only make her defensive. She would play the victim crying and spinning a lie about needing a document for the wedding. Brad, weak and entirely infatuated, would undoubtedly take her side. I would lose my son forever, and she would simply find another more covert way to destroy my life. I needed to let her think she was winning. I needed to let her proceed with her plan so I could expose the entire rotten structure of her deception. I needed to map out every single weak point in her scheme and prepare a controlled demolition. I slowly stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, letting the darkness hide me completely. I stood there in the silent house watching the erratic beam of her flashlight dance across my life savings, and I made a silent vow to Carolyn. I would not let this parasite steal our legacy. I took a slow, long, and steadying breath, forcing my racing heart rate to calm completely. I knew I had to carefully retreat to my bedroom and act perfectly normal the next morning. I would have to put on my tailored suit, walk down the long aisle, and smile brightly for the photographer while this wicked woman sealed her false vows. I would have to flawlessly play the role of the generous, slightly befuddled father. Every instinct screamed at me to stop the wedding, to confront her face to face, but logic strictly demanded complete patience and calculation. I turned away from the study and walked silently back down the hall. Tomorrow, the most dangerous game of my life would undoubtedly begin. I would absolutely let her have her beautiful wedding day. But she had absolutely no idea what absolute hell I was currently preparing to systematically unleash upon her entire criminal life. As I walked silently back down the dark hallway, a sudden realization stopped me dead in my tracks. If I simply retreated to my bedroom, I would be giving her free rein to finish picking the lock and access my sensitive files. I needed to interrupt her immediately, but I had to do it without letting her know that I had overheard her terrifying phone call. I needed her to believe I was completely oblivious. I reached out and deliberately knocked a heavy brass picture frame off the hallway console table. The metallic crash echoed violently through the quiet house. I immediately heard a sharp gasp from the study, followed by the frantic scrambling of knees on the hardwood floor. I shuffled forward, flipping on the overhead lights, rubbing my eyes, and projecting the image of a confused, grieving widower who had simply been startled awake. Victoria practically fell out of the study doorway. She was clutching her chest, her breathing heavy, and before I could even ask a single question, the tears began to fall. They were masterfully executed. Large, glistening drops rolled down her cheeks as her face twisted into a mask of pure, innocent distress. "Oh, Richard," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I am so terribly sorry. I did not mean to wake you or startle you. I was just trying to do something special for tomorrow." I put on my best bewildered expression, asking her what she was doing on the floor of my private office at 1 a.m. She wiped her eyes delicately, sniffing with perfect cinematic timing. "I was looking for Carolyn's old recipe book," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I wanted to surprise Brad at the wedding reception. I was going to scan the handwritten recipes and put them in a beautiful slideshow. I knew you kept some of her personal journals in that cabinet, and I just wanted to find it before the morning rush." It was a brilliant, bulletproof lie. It weaponized the memory of my dead wife, making any anger on my part look like the irrational outburst of a bitter old man. I stood there looking at the lockpicks she had carelessly kicked under the edge of my rug. I wanted to tell her that Carolyn kept her recipes in the kitchen pantry, not locked in a metal filing cabinet containing property deeds and tax returns. I wanted to scream at her, but I forced myself to maintain a blank, tired stare. I simply nodded, telling her that the cabinet was locked and that she should have just asked me. The commotion had traveled upstairs. Heavy footsteps thumped down the staircase and Brad rushed into the hallway, his hair disheveled from sleep. He looked from the shattered picture frame on the floor to his weeping fiancée, and finally to me. His jaw clenched in immediate, predictable frustration. "What is going on down here?" he demanded, wrapping a protective arm around Victoria. She immediately buried her face in his shoulder, playing the fragile victim to absolute perfection. I told Brad that I had simply dropped a picture frame and found Victoria in the study. Instead of questioning why his future wife was prowling through my private office in the middle of the night, my son let out a long, heavy sigh of profound exhaustion. "Dad, you are completely overreacting again," Brad said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Victoria told me she wanted to do something sweet for the reception with Mom's recipes. Your grief is making you paranoid," he claimed. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance tightening his grip on Victoria. "You have been so confused lately, Dad. You are forgetting things. Just yesterday I found your spare set of car keys inside the kitchen freezer next to the frozen vegetables. The air in my lungs turned instantly to ice. The keys in the freezer. Yesterday morning I had spent 20 minutes searching for my spare keys before finally giving up and using my main set. I had blamed it on simple absent-mindedness. But hearing the words out of my son's mouth, the terrifying truth clicked into place. I had not left my keys in the freezer. Victoria had taken them from the counter and deliberately hidden them there. She was systematically planting physical evidence of cognitive decline around my house. She was actively gaslighting my son, creating a documented history of my supposed dementia so that when she eventually filed for a legal conservatorship, Brad would willingly testify against my mental competence. It was a strategy so cold and calculated that it left me momentarily breathless. I looked at Brad, seeing how easily his mind had been molded by her subtle manipulations. I did not defend myself. I knew arguing would only cement his belief that I was losing my grip on reality. I simply lowered my gaze to the floor, muttered a quiet apology about being overtired, and slowly shuffled back to my bedroom. I left them standing in the hallway, letting Victoria believe her wicked little performance had completely succeeded. The next afternoon was a blur of crystal centerpieces, string quartets, and lavish champagne toasts at a prestigious downtown country club. I stood by the grand ballroom entrance, formally dressed in my tailored tuxedo, playing the role of the proud father. I had personally signed the checks that paid for every single extravagant detail of this magnificent celebration. I paid for the imported silk table runners, the 5-course gourmet meal, and the massive floral archway where Victoria had stood just an hour earlier, exchanging empty vows with my son. The irony tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. I stood near a towering column, nursing a glass of sparkling water, and carefully observed my new daughter-in-law working the room. Victoria was a masterful actress. She glided seamlessly between the elegantly decorated tables, her white gown trailing beautifully behind her. But I noticed a sickening pattern. Every time she approached my former engineering colleagues, our extended family members, or my closest friends, she would lean in close. She would lower her voice to a concerned whisper, placing a gentle hand on their arms. I did not need to hear the exact words to know what she was doing. I could read her body language perfectly. I watched her glance sympathetically in my direction, shaking her head with a manufactured look of profound sorrow. Then my friends would look over at me, their faces instantly softening with tragic pity. She was actively building a public consensus that I was losing my mind. She was recruiting witnesses for her future courtroom battle, ensuring that when she eventually filed the legal paperwork to seize control of my entire life, an entire room full of respectable people would easily testify that poor Richard had been slipping for months. I took a deep and steady breath, maintaining my rigid, polite smile for the passing servers. I stood silently in the corner, carefully watching her every single move, quietly calculating my own impending and devastating counterattack against this absolute calculating monster who thought she had already won. 2 days after the wedding, the house finally settled back into a heavy, unbroken silence. Brad and Victoria had left for a brief local honeymoon up the coast before their scheduled flight to Europe. The caterers were gone, the rented chairs were returned, and the lingering smell of expensive floral arrangements had completely faded from the living room. It was just me, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the lingering echo of a betrayal that demanded my immediate attention. I walked into my ground floor study, closed the heavy oak door, and locked it securely behind me. The time for playing the confused, grieving widower was temporarily suspended. I needed to know exactly what Victoria had managed to access during her midnight lock-picking session before I had interrupted her. I approached the metal filing cabinet. As a structural engineer, my entire life had been governed by strict organization, precise measurements, and flawless record-keeping. Every single folder in that cabinet was meticulously indexed, color-coded, and aligned perfectly. I pulled the drawer open and began a thorough, methodical inventory of my most sensitive financial documents. I checked the life insurance policies, the deed to the house, and the retirement accounts. Everything appeared completely untouched. But as my fingers traced the back of the second drawer, my heart skipped a beat. A very specific heavy manila envelope was entirely missing. It was not an envelope containing standard bank statements or social security information. If she had wanted to simply steal my identity or drain my checking account, she would have taken the front folders. No, Victoria was hunting for something much larger, and she had unfortunately found a crucial piece of the puzzle. The missing envelope contained the preliminary tax documents for a completely separate corporate entity. It was the only tangible physical connection in this house to the massive secret my late wife had left behind. To understand the sheer magnitude of Victoria's greed, you have to understand who Carolyn truly was. Carolyn came from a very quiet, fiercely private farming family in Colorado. When she passed away 8 months ago, she did not just leave me a collection of beautiful memories and a house in the suburbs. She left me a 5,000-acre ranch stretching across the rugged Colorado landscape. On the surface, the land was entirely barren, dry, and practically worthless to an untrained eye. But Carolyn knew the hidden value of her family's legacy. That dusty expanse of land held absolute grandfathered water and mineral rights. In a region currently facing severe resource shortages, those rights were the holy grail for major corporate developers. Just 3 months before she died, Carolyn and I received a formal, aggressively structured buyout offer from an energy conglomerate. They wanted the land, the water, and the minerals. The offer was $45 million. I remember sitting on the edge of her hospital bed as she held my hand, her breathing shallow, but her mind razor-sharp. She made me swear to place the ranch into a legally impenetrable blind trust. She warned me with chilling accuracy that our son Brad was fundamentally weak. She knew he possessed a good heart, but lacked the spine to stand up to manipulative people. And she saw right through Victoria from the very first dinner we shared. Carolyn explicitly told me that if Victoria ever discovered the true value of that Colorado property, she would stop at nothing to sink her claws into every single penny. I followed my wife's dying wish perfectly. I established the blind trust shielding the asset completely from public record. I lived on my modest engineering pension, driving my old truck, and maintaining the illusion of a comfortable but thoroughly middle-class retirement. I stood in my study staring at the empty space in the filing cabinet, and the terrifying reality of Victoria's master plan finally clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Victoria was not just a social climber. She was a high-end, ruthless real estate broker. She spent her days digging through property records, analyzing corporate shells and hunting for hidden assets for her wealthy clients. She must have run a deep, comprehensive background check on my financial history when Brad proposed to her. She was looking for leverage, looking to see exactly what she was marrying into. Because the trust was blind, she could not see the actual value or the direct ownership. But she was a professional. She must have found a tiny breadcrumb, perhaps a tax discrepancy, a registered limited liability company name, or an obscure county filing that connected my name to that massive Colorado acreage. She knew I was holding on to something massive. The missing tax envelope was the final confirmation she needed. It contained the exact legal name of the trust and the contact information for the holding company. But finding the trust was only the first step. Because the asset was shielded, she could not touch it, sell it, or transfer the mineral rights simply by being my daughter-in-law. She needed direct, unquestionable legal authority over my signature. That was exactly why she was so desperate to secure a durable power of attorney. That was why she was planting my car keys in the freezer, whispering to my friends at the wedding reception, and desperately building a public narrative that I was suffering from rapid onset dementia. If she could legally declare me mentally incompetent, she would gain full conservatorship over my entire estate. With that piece of paper, she could bypass the blind trust force the sale of the $45 million water rights and liquidate the asset directly into her own accounts. She would claim she was doing it to fund my round-the-clock medical care. Brad would simply nod and agree, entirely oblivious to the massive fortune being stolen right out from under his own family name. She would lock me away in a facility, medicated and forgotten, while she and my son lived like royalty on Carolyn's stolen legacy. I felt a wave of cold, calculating fury wash over my entire body. She had taken my grief, the most vulnerable period of my entire life, and weaponized it into a real estate transaction. She thought my silence was weakness. She thought my trembling hands were a sign of a decaying mind. She had absolutely no idea that I spent my entire career anticipating structural failures and designing reinforcements to crush applied pressure. She wanted to play a high-stakes game of legal manipulation, but she had vastly underestimated the man she was trying to bury. I locked the filing cabinet, placed the key back in my pocket, and sat down at my heavy mahogany desk. I did not feel tired anymore. I did not feel the heavy weight of sorrow that had plagued me for 8 long months. I felt an intense, burning clarity. I pulled a fresh legal pad from my drawer and uncapped my pen. I needed to move faster than her. I needed to set a trap so completely flawless, so structurally sound, that when she finally stepped into it, her entire life would collapse around her. I began to write down my countermeasures, preparing to strike back with everything I had. I would protect Carolyn's ranch at all absolute costs. Victoria was about to learn a devastating permanent lesson in respect. The following Tuesday afternoon, Victoria arrived at my house completely unannounced. She claimed she was simply dropping by to check on my health and bring me a fresh batch of homemade blueberry muffins. I knew the truth, of course. She was performing necessary reconnaissance. She desperately needed to assess my mental state after my sudden refusal to sign the power of attorney document the previous week. She needed to know if my hesitation was a brief moment of clarity or just a symptom of the confusion she was desperately trying to manufacture. I invited her inside, maintaining the slow, deliberate shuffle of a man whose best days were firmly behind him. I thanked her for the muffins with a wavering voice, playing the role of the grateful, lonely widower to absolute perfection. She smiled her polished, hollow smile and went straight to the kitchen to brew us a pot of coffee. She moved through my home with a sickening sense of ownership, opening cabinets and arranging mugs as if she were already measuring the square footage for a real estate listing. I sat heavily in my favorite armchair in the living room, resting my hands on my cane. I knew this was the exact moment to strike. I needed to gauge the depth of her desperation. I needed to see exactly how much pressure it would take to crack her flawless facade and force her into making a catastrophic tactical error. I reached into my cardigan pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and deliberately dialed the automated customer service line for my local bank. As the automated voice began listing menu options in my ear, I cleared my throat and spoke loudly, projecting my voice so it would carry perfectly into the kitchen where Victoria was pouring the coffee. "Hello, yes, I need to speak to a senior loan officer regarding a massive reverse mortgage on my primary residence," I announced, injecting a tone of reckless manic energy into my voice. "Yes, my name is Richard Alden. I am looking to liquidate as much equity as legally possible, and I want to expedite the process immediately." I paused, pretending to listen to a human representative. I nodded enthusiastically, staring straight ahead at the blank television screen. "Well, the truth is, I have decided to completely change my life. I am 70 years old, and I am incredibly tired of sitting in this empty house. I want to purchase a luxury yacht, a 60-foot catamaran to be exact. I plan to hire a full professional crew and sail the Mediterranean indefinitely. I do not care about the current interest rates or the closing costs. I just want the maximum cash payout as soon as humanly possible. I want to spend every last dime I have while I can still walk and enjoy the ocean breeze." I continued this one-sided conversation, intentionally layering in details designed to trigger an absolute meltdown in a greedy real estate broker. I talked loudly about cashing out my retirement accounts, willingly taking penalty hits for early withdrawals, and mentioned that I was even considering donating a massive portion of my remaining liquid estate to a rather obscure wildlife charity in South America. I painted the picture of an erratic, impulsive old man who was about to cheerfully set fire to millions of dollars in generational wealth. The reaction was instantaneous and violently physical. I heard a sharp, panicked gasp from the kitchen, followed immediately by the loud, shattering crash of thick ceramic against the hardwood floor. Victoria had dropped the coffee mug. I ended the fake call, slipping the phone back into my pocket, and turned my head slowly toward the kitchen archway. Victoria was standing frozen over a spreading pool of dark, steaming coffee and jagged white ceramic shards. Her meticulously crafted mask of sweet, daughterly concern had completely vaporized. Her eyes were blown wide, staring at me with a mixture of absolute horror and unfiltered primal panic. Her jaw hung slightly slack, and her chest was heaving rapidly, as if all the oxygen had been suddenly sucked from the room. She was looking at me not as a beloved father-in-law, but as a walking financial disaster who was about to casually flush her $45 million salvation directly down the drain. She had built her entire criminal foundation on the absolute assumption that my assets would remain perfectly stagnant until she could legally seize them. She never calculated the risk of me waking up one morning and deciding to squander the very fortune she desperately needed to save her own life from the Shadow Syndicate. I looked at her with a blank, entirely innocent expression, tilting my head slightly to the side. "Oh dear, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice gentle and slightly confused. "Did the mug slip from your hands? Please be careful with the broken glass. You might cut yourself on those sharp edges." She did not look down at the broken mug. She did not grab a towel to clean up the scalding liquid spreading rapidly across my expensive oak floorboards. Instead, her hands began to shake violently. She grabbed her designer purse from the kitchen island and frantically began digging for her cell phone. Her polished composure was entirely shattered, replaced by the terrified urgency of a cornered animal. I watched her manicured thumbs fly across the illuminated screen, typing with a frantic, desperate speed. I knew exactly who she was texting. She was alerting Brad. She was telling my son that the situation was highly critical, that I was experiencing a severe manic episode, and that I was about to destroy their inheritance. She was demanding that their timeline be moved up immediately before I could sign any binding contracts with a bank or a yacht broker. I remained quietly seated in my comfortable armchair, watching the sheer terror radiate from her shaking shoulders. I had successfully set the hook. By directly threatening to destroy the asset she coveted above all else, I had stripped away her patience and her careful planning. I knew she would not wait for a gradual, subtle legal transition anymore. She was going to panic. She was going to carelessly rush her execution. And when desperate criminals rush, they make incredibly stupid, easily documented mistakes. She muttered a rushed, entirely incoherent excuse about an urgent real estate crisis, completely ignoring the massive mess on the floor, and practically ran out of my own front door. I listened intently to her car tires screech against the asphalt as she frantically sped away from the curb. I smiled a genuine cold smile, knowing the trap was now fully armed and waiting. I stood up from my chair, my tremors entirely gone, and walked into the kitchen to calmly sweep up the broken pieces of the ceramic mug. The game had fundamentally changed, and she was now playing exactly by my rules. Every frantic step she took from this moment forward would lead her directly into the devastating legal snare I was meticulously building behind the scenes. She thought she was running out of time, but her time was already truly up. The following morning, long before the sun had fully risen over the horizon, I made a quiet phone call to a trusted contact. David was a retired security contractor I had worked with on a sensitive municipal building project a decade ago. He inherently understood the absolute necessity of total discretion for this delicate job. Within 3 hours, David arrived at my back door driving an unmarked van. We did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed complete surveillance of my home, focusing on the living areas and the corridors leading to my study and kitchen. David brought 3 high-definition micro cameras, ingeniously built directly into the housing of standard air purifiers. We strategically placed one on the mantel in the living room, another on the credenza in my study, and the final one on the corner of the kitchen counter. They plugged seamlessly into the wall outlets, looking exactly like the modern appliances Carolyn and I used to buy to manage the dry Colorado dust. They recorded straight to a secure encrypted cloud server that I could easily access from my personal laptop. When David left, the house looked entirely unchanged. But the silent sentinels were now watching every single shadow. I simply had to wait for the predator to return to the feeding ground. It took exactly 2 days for Victoria to make her next move. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had purposely left my truck in the driveway, but walked down the street to the hardware store to make it appear as though I was asleep inside or wandering around the neighborhood. When I returned an hour later, I noticed the faint scent of her cloying perfume hanging in the foyer. She had used the spare key Brad had foolishly given her months ago. I did not search the house to see what she had touched. I walked straight into my study, locked the heavy door, and opened my laptop. I logged into the encrypted security portal, my heart beating with a steady anticipation. I expected to see her creeping back into this room, perhaps carrying heavier tools to pry open my filing cabinet and steal the trust documents. I loaded the kitchen camera feed first, wanting to establish a timeline of her entry. I watched the digital timestamp glow in the corner of the screen. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, Victoria strolled casually into my kitchen. She was not sneaking. She moved with an arrogant, absolute confidence, completely at ease in the home she was actively trying to steal. But she did not walk toward the hallway leading to the study. Instead, she walked directly toward the small wooden bread box where I kept my weekly plastic pill organizer. My breathing stopped completely. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my hands gripping the edge of my mahogany desk. Victoria glanced over her shoulder, a brief habitual check of the empty room, and then she reached into her expensive designer handbag. She pulled out a small, unmarked amber prescription bottle. I watched, paralyzed by a cold, creeping horror, as she popped open the Tuesday and Wednesday compartments of my pill organizer. With steady, practiced fingers, she removed my standard prescribed hypertension capsules. She slipped them into her pocket and replaced them with small, chalky white pills from her amber bottle. She snapped the plastic lids shut, wiped her fingerprints off the container, and calmly walked out of the camera frame. I sat in the absolute silence of my study, staring at the frozen frame of the video. A wave of profound, icy revulsion washed over my entire body. This was not simply a greedy woman snooping for financial records. This was not just a manipulative daughter-in-law moving my car keys around to make my son think I was becoming forgetful. This was an active, deliberate, and highly calculated biological assault. She was intentionally poisoning me. The devastating brilliance of her strategy unfolded in my mind like a complex architectural schematic. If she simply claimed I was losing my mind, a competent judge might eventually order an independent medical evaluation. A clean blood test and a sharp cognitive interview would instantly expose her lies. But if I was unknowingly ingesting a steady covert stream of low-dose sedatives or powerful psychotropic medications, the results would be catastrophic. I would begin to slur my words. My hands would develop severe, uncontrollable tremors. My memory would become genuinely fragmented and unreliable. She was artificially manufacturing the exact physical and mental symptoms of severe dementia. When she inevitably dragged me into a sterile courtroom to strip away my fundamental human rights, she would not just have Brad testifying about my strange behavior. She would have undeniable, tragic medical proof of my rapid cognitive decline. The judge would look at my shaking hands, listen to my drug-induced confusion, and grant her full conservatorship without a single moment of hesitation. She was perfectly willing to destroy my physical health and trap me in a chemical fog just to get her hands on the Colorado water rights. I felt a sudden visceral wave of nausea rising in my throat as I looked toward the hallway. I realized that my own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love and dedication I possessed, had brought a lethal predator directly into my home. Brad might not have known about the pills. He was likely too weak and oblivious to understand the true depths of his wife's depravity. But his profound cowardice had opened the door for her to slowly execute his own father. I slowly closed the laptop screen, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. The anger I felt previously was entirely gone, replaced by absolute resolve. I was no longer dealing with a simple family dispute over inheritance. I was dealing with a ruthless, calculated, attempted murder. She wanted to erase my mind so she could steal my legacy. I stood up and walked straight into the kitchen. I looked at the plastic pill organizer sitting next to the bread box. I did not touch it. I knew those white pills were the most valuable pieces of criminal evidence I possessed. I needed to know exactly what chemical weapon she was using against me. I needed to build a legal cage so impenetrable that she would never see the light of day again. I walked back to my study and picked up my phone. The time for playing defense was completely over. It was time to systematically destroy her. Every move she made from this point forward would only tighten the noose. I would let her believe she was poisoning me. I would let her believe she was winning. I would let her dig a grave so deep she could never climb out of it. The structural integrity of her plan was about to face a catastrophic failure. She thought I was an old, weak man, ready to surrender and fade into the shadows. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me the exact weapon I would use to completely ruin her entire life forever. I carefully scooped a few of the small white pills into a clean plastic vial, slipped it into my coat pocket, and left the rest of her toxic trap exactly as I had found it. The next morning, I announced at the breakfast table that I had a routine cardiology appointment. Victoria offered to drive me, her eyes gleaming with manufactured concern, but I politely declined, insisting I needed the fresh air. I drove straight into the heart of downtown Denver to a heavy granite building housing the offices of Mitch Gallagher. Mitch was 68 years old, a ruthless, brilliant estate lawyer who had handled Carolyn's family affairs for 3 decades. He was a man devoid of sentimentality, possessing a mind like a steel trap, and a profound disdain for predatory relatives. I bypassed the receptionist and walked directly into his oak-paneled office. Mitch took one look at my face, closed his heavy leather binder, and locked his solid wooden door. We did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. I pulled my laptop from my leather briefcase, set it squarely on his desk, and brought up the encrypted cloud server. I did not offer any dramatic preamble. I simply pressed play on the kitchen camera feed from the previous afternoon. Mitch sat perfectly still, his sharp gray eyes locked onto the screen, as Victoria casually swapped my hypertension medication with her unknown white pills. He watched her wipe the plastic organizer clean and stroll out of the frame. The heavy silence in the office was absolute. Mitch did not gasp or express shock. He was a man who had spent 40 years navigating the darkest corners of human greed. He simply leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and exhaled a long, measured breath. He looked at me with a cold, terrifying clarity. He told me that in all his years of practice he had seen families tear each other apart over inheritances, but attempted chemical incapacitation was an entirely different level of depravity. I placed the plastic vial containing the stolen white pills onto his desk. I told him I needed to know exactly what she was giving me, and I needed to know immediately. Mitch picked up the vial, his expression turning to stone. He promised me he would have a trusted courier deliver the samples to a private, highly secure toxicology laboratory before noon. He assured me the technicians there operated with absolute discretion and would provide a comprehensive chemical breakdown within 48 hours. But then Mitch leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk, and dropped a bombshell that completely shattered whatever lingering illusion I had left regarding my son. He told me that Victoria was not acting alone. 3 days ago, my own son, Brad, had called Mitch's private office line. Brad had asked a series of very specific, highly technical questions regarding the exact legal requirements needed to forcibly declare a surviving parent mentally incompetent in the state of Colorado. The air vanished from my lungs. My chest tightened with a suffocating, unbearable pressure. I had spent the last week desperately trying to convince myself that Brad was just a foolish, naive pawn. I wanted to believe that Victoria was manipulating him, blinding him to her criminal intentions with her beauty and her calculated charm. I wanted to believe that the boy I had raised, the boy I had taught to fish and ride a bicycle, was simply ignorant of the evil sleeping in his own bed. But Mitch destroyed that comforting lie with a few simple, devastating sentences. Brad had not just asked about a standard power of attorney. He had specifically inquired about the medical thresholds for involuntary conservatorship, asking how long the legal process would take if multiple witnesses testified to severe cognitive decline. My son was not a passive bystander. He was an active, willing participant in a coordinated conspiracy to legally erase me from existence. He was actively plotting to lock his own father away in a psychiatric facility just to secure an early payout on an inheritance he felt entitled to possess. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly sickening, that it felt like a physical blow to my internal organs. I closed my eyes and pictured the two of them lying in their bed, whispering in the dark, patiently waiting for my mind to crumble so they could inherit a fortune they did not earn and did not deserve. Every memory I had of my son, playing in our backyard every late night I spent helping him with his homework. Every single moment of pride I felt when he graduated from college was instantly overwritten by the stark reality of his calculated treachery. He was willing to sacrifice my health and my freedom for a payout. A profound, freezing numbness replaced the sorrow. I looked at Mitch, my voice dropping to a harsh, mechanical whisper. I told him I wanted to burn their entire world to the ground. Mitch offered a grim, shark-like smile. He pulled a fresh legal pad across his desk, uncapped his silver fountain pen, and nodded slowly. We spent the next 3 hours dismantling Victoria's grand design and engineering a counterstrike so legally complex it would leave them absolutely destitute. Mitch explained that simply exposing the pills to the police might not be enough to protect the massive ranch asset if they somehow claimed I had accidentally mixed up my own medication due to my supposed dementia. We needed to make the Colorado Blind Trust entirely untouchable before we contacted any law enforcement authorities. We began drafting the aggressive legal paperwork to transfer the grandfathered water and mineral rights out of the original trust and bury them behind a secondary, impenetrable corporate shield. We established a new offshore holding company layering the ownership so deeply that even a court-ordered forensic accountant would spend a decade trying to untangle the corporate structures. We transferred every single liquid asset I possessed into highly secure, irrevocable trusts that explicitly named charitable foundations as the sole beneficiaries in the event of my death or legal incapacitation. If Victoria and Brad managed to get a judge to declare me incompetent, they would inherit absolute control over a completely empty shell. The $45 million fortune would instantly evaporate from their grasp, legally locked away forever behind a fortress of ironclad documentation. Furthermore, Mitch drafted a massive, devastating lawsuit for elder abuse fraud and attempted chemical assault, preparing the civil and criminal documents to be filed simultaneously the moment the toxicology report confirmed the true identity of the pills. We mapped out every single legal maneuver, calculating the precise timing of our impending strike down to the exact hour. We discussed how to lure them into a controlled environment where their lies could be publicly dismantled. By the time I walked out of his office, the bright Denver sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the city pavement. I drove back to my house with a terrifying sense of calm. My legacy was now fortified behind miles of legal concrete. My treacherous son and his wicked bride were walking blindly toward a catastrophic demolition. They thought they were the architects of my destruction, but they had merely handed me the blueprints to construct their ultimate financial and personal ruin. I parked my truck in the driveway and walked through my front door with my head held extremely high, ready to finalize the complete and total eradication of their malicious, unforgivable greed. The battle lines were officially drawn, and they had absolutely no idea that I possessed all the ammunition. I walked into the kitchen, poured the tainted coffee down the drain, and began to prepare my own meals from now on. They were completely unaware that the very man they sought to bury was the one currently digging their grave, and I was going to make sure they fell into it together. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when my phone shattered the quiet solitude of my kitchen. It was Mitch Gallagher. His voice was sharper than usual, stripped of its customary dry sarcasm. He told me to come to his office immediately, bypassing the usual pleasantries entirely. He stated that the toxicology report on the white pills had returned exactly as we suspected, confirming the presence of a potent, fast-acting central nervous system depressant designed to mimic severe neurological decay. However, that was not the primary reason for his urgent call. The private investigator Mitch had retained to dig into Victoria's background had just delivered a massive encrypted file, and the contents fundamentally altered the entire landscape of our impending war. I left my coffee untouched on the counter, grabbed my coat, and drove through the waking city streets with a heavy sense of impending revelation. When I stepped into Mitch's oak-paneled office, he was not sitting behind his massive desk. He was standing by the window, staring down at the morning traffic, holding a thick manila folder. He turned to face me, his gray eyes unusually solemn. He tossed the heavy folder onto the polished mahogany surface and instructed me to sit down. He told me that we had fundamentally misjudged Victoria. We had assumed she was simply a greedy, opportunistic real estate broker looking to accelerate her ascension into the upper echelon of wealthy society. We thought she wanted the $45 million Colorado water rights to fund a life of effortless luxury designer clothes and exotic vacations. We were completely wrong. She was not just greedy, she was incredibly, profoundly desperate. She was a cornered animal fighting for her actual survival. Mitch opened the folder, revealing pages of dense financial spreadsheets, intercepted emails, and wire transfer logs. He began to outline a story of monumental arrogance and catastrophic failure. 2 years ago, Victoria had attempted to transition from a mere broker to a primary developer. She had found a prime piece of commercial real estate and planned to build a towering, ultra-luxury condominium complex. It was supposed to be her masterpiece, the project that would solidify her reputation and secure her financial independence forever. But the project was severely underfunded from the start. When traditional banks took one look at her highly leveraged portfolio and aggressively declined her loan applications, she refused to accept defeat. Her ego simply would not allow her to walk away from the massive development. Instead of scaling back or finding legitimate investors, Victoria made a fatal, arrogant mistake. She sought capital outside the boundaries of the legal financial system. Mitch pointed a steady finger at a series of redacted wire transfers originating from offshore shell companies. Victoria had borrowed $3 million from a highly sophisticated, completely unregulated shadow syndicate. These were not venture capitalists or aggressive hedge fund managers. These were dangerous, quiet people who operated entirely in the dark, funding high-risk ventures with exorbitant interest rates and utilizing brutally unforgiving collection methods. For the first year, Victoria had managed to keep the project afloat, desperately juggling funds and hiding the structural delays from her contractors. But 6 months ago, the entire development completely collapsed. The city revoked her primary zoning permits due to severe environmental violations. The contractors walked off the job, and the partially constructed concrete shell was seized by municipal authorities. The $3 million investment evaporated into thin air. The Shadow Syndicate did not care about zoning laws or municipal seizures. They only cared about their money, and they expected an immediate total repayment with interest. Mitch handed me a printed transcript of a text message exchange intercepted by his investigator. The messages were chilling in their brief clinical efficiency. The syndicate had given Victoria a firm, non-negotiable 30-day deadline to return the $3 million plus an additional $1 million in penalties. The deadline was rapidly approaching. The final message simply stated that if the funds were not secured by the end of the month, the debt collection would transition from financial restitution to physical consequence. Victoria was not just facing bankruptcy or public humiliation. She was facing genuine, imminent physical danger. The syndicate would not hesitate to dismantle her life and potentially her physical safety to make an example of a defaulting debtor. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a terrifying, heavy finality. This was the exact reason why Victoria was moving with such reckless, frantic speed. This was why she could not wait for me to pass away naturally. This was why she was actively poisoning me with sedatives and desperately manufacturing the illusion of dementia. The Colorado Trust was not a luxury upgrade for her. The $45 million water and mineral rights were her literal lifeline. If she could successfully seize control of my estate through a forced legal conservatorship, she could immediately liquidate a fraction of the Colorado asset to pay off the syndicate, saving her own life, while securing tens of millions in pure profit for her future. I was nothing more than an inconvenient speed bump on her frantic road to basic survival. But as I sat there processing the sheer magnitude of her desperation, a much darker, much more devastating realization began to take root in my mind. I thought about Brad. I thought about his heavy sighs, his sudden eagerness to dismiss my concerns, and his quiet phone call to Mitch's office inquiring about the legal thresholds for involuntary conservatorship. I had assumed Brad was just weak, manipulated by a beautiful, cunning woman into believing his father was genuinely losing his mind. But looking at the brutal reality of the syndicate debt, the truth became entirely undeniable. Brad knew. He might not have known about the poisoned pills, but he absolutely knew about the $3 million shadow debt and the violent people hunting his new wife. Brad was terrified. He was a man accustomed to a safe, insulated suburban existence, suddenly thrust into a world of shadow loans and physical threats. He knew Victoria was in terrible danger, and he knew his own life would undoubtedly be ruined if the syndicate decided to punish her. Instead of turning to the authorities, instead of coming to me for honest help, my son had made a conscious, unforgivable choice. He had decided to sacrifice his own father to pay his wife's criminal debts. He was perfectly willing to watch me be dragged into a courtroom, declared mentally incompetent, and locked away in a sterile facility for the remainder of my life, just so he could use my hard-earned legacy to buy his way out of a nightmare. He was throwing me directly to the wolves to save his own skin. The betrayal was a festering wound that fundamentally altered my entire perception of my family. I looked up from the financial documents, meeting Mitch's sharp, expectant gaze. The anger simmering in my chest crystallized into pure, unadulterated resolve. I reached across the desk, closing the thick manila folder with a definitive snap. I told Mitch to finalize the corporate shields. The time for observation was officially over. I drove back to my house under the heavy, bruised sky of a late autumn evening. The drive from Mitch Gallagher's office had given me the necessary time to mentally prepare for the most difficult and agonizing performance of my entire life. I parked my truck in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, taking a final deep breath to center my racing heart. I was no longer an observant father trying to protect his son. I was an active combatant in a war for my own survival. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open intentionally, letting my heavy work boots drag across the wooden threshold. I stumbled slightly, catching myself heavily against the hallway console table, making sure the brass lamp rattled loudly enough to announce my arrival. Brad and Victoria were sitting at the kitchen island reviewing some paperwork. They had returned from their brief coastal getaway, undoubtedly anxious to finalize their treacherous plans before their deadline expired. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine to mimic the physical weight of rapid cognitive decay. I released a long, trembling breath and shuffled toward the kitchen, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. The performance had officially begun, and I needed to be absolutely flawless. As I entered the bright kitchen, I deliberately dropped my keychain onto the ceramic tile floor. The metal keys clattered loudly, scattering across the grout lines. I did not bend down to pick them up immediately. Instead, I stood there staring blankly at the floor, as if I had entirely forgotten what the objects were. Brad sighed, stepping down from his stool to retrieve them. I looked up at him, letting my eyes unfocus, staring straight through his face. "Thank you, David," I mumbled, intentionally slurring my consonants and calling him by my brother's name. I turned my gaze toward Victoria, who was watching me with an intense clinical fascination. I forced a vacant, bewildered smile onto my face. "Carolyn, did you remember to buy the milk?" I asked her, my voice wavering with a perfect imitation of senile confusion. I watched the realization wash over her perfectly contoured face. She genuinely believed the low-dose sedatives she had secretly slipped into my daily pill organizer were finally taking a catastrophic toll on my brain. She thought the chemical cocktail had successfully shattered my neurological pathways. Victoria quickly stepped forward, her voice dripping with that sickening, manufactured sweetness. "It is Victoria Richard," she cooed, gently placing a hand on my trembling arm. "Carolyn has been gone for a while. Why do you not go sit down in your comfortable chair and rest?" I let her lead me away, shuffling my feet across the living room carpet, playing the pathetic, broken old man they so desperately needed me to be. She guided me to my favorite leather armchair, the one facing the large television mounted on the far wall. She handed me the remote control, turned the volume up to a deafeningly loud level, and patted my shoulder before retreating to the kitchen. I sank into the soft leather, resting my hands on my lap, making sure to maintain a subtle, continuous tremor in my fingers. I stared fixedly at the bright, flashing pixels of the television screen, projecting the image of a man completely lost in a terminal mental fog. Because they believed I was completely incapacitated and entirely deafened by the loud television broadcast, their sheer hubris took over. They completely dropped their guard. They did not even bother to retreat to the privacy of the guest room or lower their voices to a hushed whisper. They stood just 15 feet behind me, separated only by the open floor plan of the house, and began to openly discuss the mechanics of their criminal conspiracy. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked forward, my ears straining to capture every single sickening syllable. The sheer arrogance of their conversation was breathtaking. Victoria spoke with the rapid, clipped efficiency of a corporate executive closing a hostile merger. She complained about the tight 30-day deadline imposed by the Shadow Syndicate, her voice laced with a genuine, palpable terror that she masked with aggressive planning. Brad tried to calm her down, but his own voice betrayed his deep underlying cowardice. He asked her if she was absolutely certain the trust documents were vulnerable. Victoria let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. She bragged about her real estate connections, detailing exactly how she had traced the obscure county tax filings back to the barren Colorado acreage. She told my son that the grandfathered water and mineral rights were the holy grail of regional development. Then she uttered the exact horrifying sentence I had been waiting for. "Once he signs the POA, I will execute the sale of the water rights to the Denver Syndicate," she stated with absolute, terrifying clarity. "We will use the first $3 million to clear the construction debt, and we walk away with the rest." Brad did not argue. He did not defend me. He simply agreed, telling her that they just needed to keep me comfortable and confused for a few more days until the lawyer finalized the paperwork. I sat motionless in my leather armchair, absorbing the absolute reality of my son's unforgivable complicity. He was standing there drinking my coffee, living under my roof, and calmly agreeing to a plan that would systematically erase my entire existence. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was staggering, a dark void where his conscience should have been. Every word they spoke hammered into my soul like a rusted nail. My own flesh and blood was actively negotiating the price of my freedom and my sanity. He was willingly handing my life over to a desperate woman and a violent criminal syndicate just to secure his own unearned luxury. The profound sorrow that had gripped me since Carolyn's death completely evaporated in that quiet living room, instantly replaced by a silent, consuming fury. I stared blankly at the mindless television program, but I was not seeing the bright colors or hearing the loud artificial laughter of the studio audience. I was seeing the precise, devastating legal trap Mitch Gallagher and I had constructed just hours earlier. I let my hands continue to shake softly on my knees, maintaining the flawless illusion of my utter defeat. But internally, my rage hardened into cold, impenetrable steel. They believed they were the brilliant architects of a perfect financial crime. They thought I was a helpless, decaying obstacle waiting to be casually swept aside. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for the exact right moment to trigger the explosive charges that would reduce their entire greedy, pathetic existence to ash. I would give them their power of attorney. I would let them walk directly into the snare, and then I would lock the heavy iron door firmly behind them. There would be no mercy, no hesitation, and absolutely no retreat. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing, inescapable weight of their own monumental, devastating, and entirely irreversible failures forever. The morning sun cast long, pale streaks across the hardwood floor of my living room, illuminating the exact spot where Victoria had stood 24 hours earlier, gleefully planning my demise. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in my steady hands, when my secure burner phone vibrated against the granite countertop. I had purchased the untraceable device the previous afternoon, leaving my primary smartphone completely powered down in the master bedroom to maintain the illusion of my technological incompetence. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. Mitch Gallagher did not bother with a greeting. His voice was a low mechanical rumble vibrating with a tightly coiled professional fury. He told me the private toxicology laboratory had worked through the night to isolate the exact chemical composition of the unmarked white pills Victoria had meticulously planted in my daily organizer. The results were not just disturbing, they were legally catastrophic. The pills were a highly concentrated synthetic cocktail of heavy benzodiazepines mixed with a potent muscle relaxant, specifically designed for rapid absorption. Mitch explained the brutal physiological mechanics of the drug. If I had unknowingly ingested that heavy narcotic cocktail alongside my standard morning coffee, my central nervous system would have been immediately and violently suppressed. My speech would have become severely slurred, my motor functions would have completely deteriorated into uncontrollable tremors, and my short-term memory would have been completely wiped clean. I would have appeared to the outside world as a man suffering from a sudden, catastrophic neurological collapse. Mitch read the medical examiner summary verbatim. The dosage was high enough to guarantee profound disorientation, but carefully measured to avoid inducing a fatal respiratory failure. She wanted me alive, but entirely pliable. Mitch paused, letting the clinical horror of the report settle into the quiet air of my kitchen. He stated with absolute, unwavering legal certainty that this elevated her actions from simple financial manipulation to a severe, premeditated felony. We were no longer simply looking at civil fraud. We were dealing with attempted poisoning, aggravated elder abuse, and a coordinated conspiracy to commit profound bodily harm. I listened to his words, feeling a dark, icy calm spread through my veins. My own daughter-in-law had coldly calculated the exact chemical dosage required to paralyze my mind and strip away my basic human dignity, all while my son stood by and eagerly anticipated the massive financial payout. Before I could even fully process the sheer malice of the toxicology report, Mitch seamlessly pivoted to the next devastating piece of our rapidly expanding counteroffensive. The private investigator he had retained to shadow Victoria had just delivered a massive encrypted file detailing the specific logistical mechanics of her impending trap. Victoria was a licensed real estate broker, which meant she perfectly understood that simply holding a forged power of attorney document was absolutely worthless without a verified official notarization. She needed a legally binding stamp to present to the corporate buyers of the Colorado water rights. Mitch informed me that she had already scheduled a private in-home appointment for the following Tuesday at exactly 2 p.m. However, the man she had hired was not a standard, reputable municipal official. The investigator had pulled the background file on her chosen notary, a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur was a disgraced, permanently disbarred former attorney who had lost his legal license over a decade ago. He currently operated deep within the criminal underworld, specializing exclusively in providing fraudulent official seals for coerced real estate transfers and illegal corporate liquidations. He was a known associate of the exact same shadow syndicate that currently held the $3 million death warrant over Victoria's head. The plan was brilliantly evil in its simplicity. Arthur would arrive at my home under the guise of a routine legal visit. Victoria and Brad would present me heavily drugged and completely disoriented from the benzodiazepines to this fraudulent official. They would physically guide my trembling hand across the signature line of the durable power of attorney document. Arthur would then stamp the paperwork with his counterfeit seal, legally certifying that I was of sound mind and acting entirely of my own free will. With that single fraudulent stroke of a pen, my $45 million Colorado ranch would instantly become Victoria's personal property, completely ready to be liquidated to the Denver syndicate. Mitch's voice was razor-sharp as he detailed the criminal conspiracy. Victoria was not leaving a single detail to chance. She had orchestrated a flawless closed-loop system of deception, bringing a professional fraudster directly into my living room to guarantee the theft of my legacy. I took a slow, deep breath, staring at the digital clock glowing softly on my kitchen oven. I told Mitch that we needed to stop playing defense. It was time to aggressively assemble the guillotine. Mitch entirely agreed. The sheer scale of the conspiracy involving millions of dollars, interstate wire fraud, chemical endangerment, and a known criminal syndicate meant we could no longer keep this contained to a quiet civil courtroom. We needed overwhelming, undeniable law enforcement intervention. Mitch informed me that he had already initiated a highly secure back-channel conversation with the local chief of police, a man he had known personally for 20 years. But local jurisdiction was not enough for a crime of this magnitude. Due to the massive value of the Colorado water rights and the direct involvement of a violent multi-state lending syndicate, Mitch had also brought the Federal Bureau of Investigation into the fold. We spent the next 40 minutes coordinating a flawless, inescapable sting operation. The federal agents were incredibly eager to apprehend Arthur Vance, as he had been a high-priority target for years, and Victoria's reckless desperation had finally given them the perfect bait. We established the precise parameters of the trap. I would continue to play the role of the heavily sedated failing father. I would remain in my house pretending to swallow her toxic pills while secretly depositing them into the sterile plastic evidence vials Mitch had provided. We would allow Victoria and Brad to bring the disgraced notary directly into my living room. We would let them present the fraudulent power of attorney documents. We would let them explicitly state their intentions on the hidden surveillance cameras David had installed in my air purifiers. Mitch outlined the final devastating sequence of events. At exactly 2:15 on Tuesday afternoon, a coordinated task force of local police officers and federal agents would be stationed entirely out of sight, surrounding the entire perimeter of my property. They would be monitoring the live audio and video feeds from my hidden cameras. The absolute moment Victoria handed me the pen and Arthur Vance placed his fraudulent stamp upon the paper, the trap would violently spring shut. They would not receive a quiet summons or a polite legal warning. They would be arrested on the spot in the very living room they were trying to steal, facing a mountain of federal indictments. I hung up the secure burner phone. I simply had to wait for Tuesday. I hung up the secure burner phone. I simply had to wait for Tuesday. The morning of the confrontation broke with a cold and gray light that slowly crept across my bedroom floor. I woke up hours before my usual time, my mind completely clear and entirely free of the artificial fog Victoria had desperately tried to inflict upon me. I lay there in the quiet dawn listening to the familiar settling of the old house. Today was the day. The elaborate, sickening theater production we had all been participating in was finally coming to its devastating conclusion. I threw off the heavy quilt and stood up, my joints popping in the quiet room. I did not take my prescribed hypertension medication, nor did I touch the toxic white pills still sitting untouched in my plastic organizer. I needed my mind to be as sharp as a surgical scalpel. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a strong pot of black coffee. The bitter, dark liquid burned my throat in the best possible way, waking my senses and grounding me in the stark reality of what was about to happen. I took my steaming mug into the living room and stood before the large mahogany bookshelf where I kept the framed photographs of my family. I deliberately bypassed the pictures of Brad's college graduation and his recent lavish wedding. I went straight to a silver frame holding a portrait of Carolyn. She was smiling brightly, her hair blowing in the wind during a trip we took to the coast just a few years before she got sick. I stared into her eyes, remembering the fierce, unwavering strength that defined her entire life. She had known. She had looked at our son and seen the fatal flaw in his character. She had looked at Victoria and instantly recognized the absolute vacuum of morality hiding behind her designer clothes and perfect teeth. Carolyn had trusted me to be the final line of defense for her family's legacy. I placed my hand against the cool glass of the frame. I spoke softly into the empty room, making a solemn, unbreakable vow to my late wife. I promised her that the beautiful, expansive Colorado ranch her grandfather had built from the dirt would absolutely not be liquidated to satisfy a criminal debt. I swore that the parasites who had invaded our home and plotted to erase my existence would never touch a single dime of our hard-earned life. They had underestimated our bond, and they were going to pay for their greed with their freedom. I finished my coffee and carried the empty mug back to the sink. The digital clock on the oven read noon. I had exactly 2 hours to finalize the stage. I walked through the house methodically, checking the environmental variables. I adjusted the blinds in the living room to ensure the natural light would perfectly illuminate the coffee table where the fraudulent documents were sure to be signed. I checked the hidden micro cameras David had installed. The tiny, completely invisible lenses buried within the air purifiers were functioning flawlessly, their small indicator lights confirming they were actively connected to the secure network. I logged into my laptop one final time, verifying the encrypted cloud feed was recording high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. Every angle was perfectly aligned to capture faces, documents, and dialogue. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and sent a single predetermined text message to Mitch Gallagher. The message simply stated that the door was unlocked and the stage was set. Mitch replied less than a minute later, confirming that the entire operation was green and moving into its final phase. The local police chief and the federal agents had already established their invisible perimeter. Unmarked vehicles were currently parked silently in the narrow alleyway behind my back fence and along the cross street. They were completely out of sight, but stationed less than 60 seconds away from my front door. The snare was fully armed, and the hunters were simply waiting for my command. I placed the burner phone inside an empty cereal box in the pantry, ensuring it would not ring and ruin my carefully constructed illusion. I then walked back into the living room and sat down heavily in my leather armchair. It was time to completely inhabit the role of the broken, chemically subdued victim. I focused on my breathing, slowing it down to a shallow, ragged rhythm. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine to diminish my physical presence. I relaxed the muscles in my face, letting my jaw hang slightly slack, adopting a vacant, confused stare that focused on nothing in particular. I brought my hands to rest on my knees, commanding my fingers to initiate a continuous, subtle tremor. I had spent the last week perfecting this pathetic display, practicing the exact physical manifestations of a man whose central nervous system was collapsing under the weight of heavy sedatives. I sat there in the profound silence of my home, a predator perfectly disguised as wounded prey, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind against the window panes felt incredibly amplified. Finally, at exactly 10 minutes before 2 in the afternoon, the distinct crunch of tires on gravel broke the silence. I did not move my head. I kept my eyes locked on the blank television screen, letting my peripheral vision capture the movement outside the large bay window. A sleek, black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway, parking directly behind my old work truck. I watched as the doors opened. Brad stepped out first, wearing a tailored suit, looking anxiously up and down the quiet suburban street. He was clearly vibrating with nervous energy, terrified of the massive criminal threshold he was about to cross. Victoria emerged from the passenger side, clutching her expensive leather briefcase tightly to her chest. Her face was set in a mask of grim, desperate determination. She was so close to her $45 million salvation, she could practically taste it. Then the back door of the sedan opened, and a third figure stepped out onto my driveway. He was an older man, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit that looked a decade out of style. He carried a battered leather satchel and walked with a slight, shuffling limp. This was Arthur Vance, the permanently disbarred fraudster, the man who specialized in forging official seals for the criminal underworld. Victoria leaned in and whispered something to Arthur, pointing a sharp finger toward my front door. Brad ran a trembling hand through his hair, taking a deep, shuddering breath before joining them on the front walkway. I listened to their heavy footsteps ascending the wooden porch steps. I heard the sharp metallic jingle of keys as Victoria bypassed the doorbell entirely, using her spare key to unlock my front door. The deadbolt clicked open with a heavy final thud. They stepped into the foyer, bringing the cold afternoon air and their absolute treachery directly into my home. The game was no longer a theoretical exercise. The players were standing directly on the stage, the cameras were rolling, and the trap was waiting for them to take the final fatal step. They walked from the tiled foyer onto the thick carpet of the living room, their dark, oppressive presence completely suffocating the remaining air in the large space. I did not turn my head to acknowledge their arrival. I kept my gaze anchored to the flashing screen of the television, allowing my jaw to hang loose and maintaining the steady, pathetic tremor in my resting hands. Victoria stepped into my peripheral vision first, moving with the rapid, predatory grace of a striking serpent. She was clutching the thick leather portfolio tightly against her designer coat, her eyes scanning the room to ensure we were completely alone. Brad trailed a few steps behind her, his hands shoved into his pockets, his posture hunched and defensive. He looked physically ill, his skin pale and slick with a cold sweat. He knew exactly what line he was crossing, and the immense weight of his absolute cowardice was visibly crushing him. Arthur Vance, the disgraced and disbarred attorney, shuffled into the room last. He smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap cologne, carrying a battered briefcase that contained the fraudulent seals. He did not look at me with pity or concern. He looked at me the way a butcher looks at a piece of meat on a processing block. I was nothing but a pathetic transaction to him, a quick, easy payday to fund his miserable, desperate existence in the dark criminal underworld. Victoria positioned herself directly between my leather armchair and the television, forcing me to look at her. We had finally arrived at the absolute precipice. This was the precise moment the nightmare had begun to unfold in my mind just weeks ago, coming full circle with a terrifying, inescapable gravity. Victoria offered a smile so completely devoid of genuine human warmth that it bordered on the grotesque. She reached into her leather portfolio and slowly extracted a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. She placed them gently onto the glass coffee table directly in front of my knees. The bold black letters across the top page clearly read, "Durable power of attorney and absolute estate control." She smoothed the pages flat with her perfectly manicured hands, acting as if she were preparing a simple birthday card rather than an instrument of total financial execution. I allowed my eyes to wander aimlessly over the crisp black text, projecting total uncomprehending confusion. I looked up at Brad silently, offering him one final, impossible chance to stop this madness, to step forward and protect the father who had given him everything. But my son simply turned his head away, staring fixedly at the blank wall above the fireplace, unable to meet my gaze. He was willingly and willfully blinding himself to my total destruction. Arthur Vance stepped forward, reaching into his breast pocket. The sharp metallic click of his heavy brass pen echoed through the painfully quiet room. He placed the pen on top of the documents directly over the signature line and stepped back with a silent, expectant nod. Victoria knelt down beside my chair, bringing her face uncomfortably close to mine. The cloying, artificial scent of her expensive perfume washed over me, masking the deep, rotting desperation that was driving her every action. She placed her cold, clammy hand over my trembling fingers, using a sickly, sweet, patronizing tone usually reserved for a confused toddler. "Richard," she cooed softly, her voice dripping with venomous, manufactured sympathy. "We know things have been getting so very difficult for you lately. You have been forgetting things, getting confused, and we are just so worried about your safety. Brad and I have found a beautiful private nursing home facility just outside the city. It has a lovely garden around-the-clock medical staff, and you will be completely taken care of. You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again." She paused momentarily, letting the horrific reality of her threat sink in. She was openly promising to lock me away in a sterile facility, stripped of my freedom, my home, and my dignity. But her arrogance simply could not be contained. She had to secure the final piece of the puzzle. "We just need you to sign this simple piece of paper to let Brad handle your complicated affairs." She continued, her thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. "You have so many messy, complicated investments to manage, Richard. Do not worry about that old barren land in Colorado. I know it has been a terrible burden on your mind. I will take that useless burden completely off your hands. I will handle the sale and make sure the money pays for your new medical care." Her fatal mistake hung heavily in the suffocating silence of the living room. She had explicitly mentioned the Colorado property. She had directly articulated her specific intent to liquidate the grandfathered water rights. She had willingly narrated her entire criminal objective into the hidden high-definition microphones, recording every single breath she took. The hook was now set so deeply in her jaw that she could never possibly tear it free. The sheer magnitude of her blind hubris was genuinely astonishing. She actually believed I was a broken, compliant fool, ready to hand over a $45 million empire for a bed in a psychiatric ward. I slowly pulled my gaze away from her perfectly contoured face and looked down at the brass pen resting on the heavy legal documents. I allowed my right hand to hover over the glass coffee table, intentionally amplifying the rhythmic jerking tremors in my fingers. I played the tragic part of the chemically subdued, defenseless victim with absolute, flawless perfection. I clumsily bumped the stack of papers, letting my knuckles scrape awkwardly against the glass, before finally managing to close my trembling grip around the cold metal barrel of the pen. Victoria released a long, shaky breath of pure relief, her shoulders dropping as she watched me secure the writing instrument. Brad finally turned his head back toward the center of the room, a pathetic, relieved grimace forming on his cowardly face. Arthur Vance finally took a half-step forward, reaching into his battered satchel to prepare his fraudulent, illegal notary stamp. They were all collectively holding their breath, waiting for the blue ink to stain the paper and finalize their massive theft. I slowly lifted the heavy brass pen high into the air, my hand shaking violently, stopping just inches above the crisp black signature line. I held it there for 3 agonizing seconds, letting their anticipation peak to an absolute crescendo. Then suddenly, my hand completely stopped shaking. The pathetic neurological tremor vanished instantly. The vacant, confused fog instantly evaporated from my tired eyes, entirely replaced by a dark, razor-sharp clarity. I looked directly into Victoria's suddenly terrified, widening eyes. I gripped both ends of the brass pen with a sudden, unyielding strength, and I snapped the heavy metal barrel completely in half. The sharp, explosive crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent house, signaling the absolute end of their reign of terror and the violent, inescapable arrival of their total destruction. The 2 halves of this broken brass pen clattered onto the thick glass of the coffee table, rolling to a stop, just inches from the fraudulent power of attorney document. The sudden sound shattered the heavy silence like a pane of glass. I slowly opened my hands, letting the broken metal serve as the absolute final punctuation to my performance. The rhythmic, pathetic tremor that had consumed my fingers vanished instantly. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling my spine lock into a rigid, commanding posture. I planted my boots firmly against the hardwood floor, raising my chin to look directly into the terrified eyes of the woman who sought to destroy me. The vacant fog I had carefully projected evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, searing clarity that pinned her where she knelt. Victoria remained frozen, her mouth parted, unable to comprehend the sudden resurrection of the man she thought she had erased. Without breaking my intense stare, I reached down into the narrow gap between the leather cushions of my armchair. My fingers closed around the manila folder I had hidden there. I pulled the file free and tossed it onto the glass table. It landed directly on top of her legal paperwork with a satisfying thud. The bold letters across the appraisal report clearly stated the market value of the Colorado water rights at $45 million. I turned my attention to the older man standing nervously near the edge of the carpet. I looked him up and down with absolute, undisguised contempt. I stated his full name, Arthur Vance, letting the syllables hang heavily in the air. I watched his eyes dart toward the front door as I systematically dismantled his pathetic existence. I told him that I knew exactly who he was and what he did for a living. I stated clearly that he was a disbarred fraudster who had lost his legal license for facilitating illegal corporate liquidations. I told him his presence in my living room was an active, willful participation in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. I pointed a steady finger at his battered leather satchel, stating that the counterfeit notary seals he carried inside were worthless. Arthur took a trembling step backward, his face draining of all color. He realized instantly that he had walked blindly into a devastating trap. He opened his mouth to offer a cowardly defense, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Victoria with a mixture of rage and sheer panic, silently cursing her for dragging him into a situation that would end in a federal prison sentence. He backed away toward the foyer, but I informed him that leaving the house would not save him from the consequences of his actions. I turned my gaze back to Victoria. She was still kneeling beside my chair, her hands gripping the edge of the glass table so tightly her knuckles were white. Her sickly, sweet smile had completely vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer horror. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice to a sharp, dangerous register. I explicitly laid out the intricate details of her monumental arrogance and her catastrophic financial failure. I cited the luxury condominium development she had tried to build and the structural collapse of her grand design. Then I dropped the final piece of information onto the table. I stated the exact amount of her debt. $3 million. I told her I knew about the unregulated shadow syndicate she had foolishly leveraged to fund her vanity project. I watched her breath hitch as I detailed the 30-day deadline they had imposed and the physical consequences she faced if she failed to deliver the funds. I told her my legacy was not going to be sacrificed to satisfy a violent criminal syndicate. She had built a cage of debt, and I was going specifically to lock her inside it. I calmly informed her that every single action she had taken in my home over the past 2 weeks had been meticulously monitored, recorded, and cataloged. I told her about the high-definition micro-cameras ingeniously hidden inside the air purifiers capturing her every movement. I detailed the moment I watched her replace my prescribed hypertension medication with her unknown pills. I explained that Mitch Gallagher had couriered those exact pills to a secure toxicology laboratory. I recited the medical examiner's summary, explicitly naming the heavy cocktail of central nervous system depressants she had utilized. I told her that her actions were legally classified as attempted poisoning and premeditated physical harm. As I spoke these words, Brad finally moved. The physical reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward away from his wife. His knees buckled slightly, and he caught himself against the heavy oak mantel of the fireplace. His face was a sickly ashen gray, slick with a cold sweat. He stared at Victoria as if looking at a terrifying stranger. He finally understood that his cowardly willingness to sacrifice his father had firmly anchored him to a sinking ship of federal indictments. The total exposure of her desperate plot did not induce a sudden apology. Instead, it triggered a complete, terrifying psychological fracture. The polished facade of the sophisticated real estate broker instantly shattered, revealing the vicious predator lurking beneath. She pushed herself up from the floor, her entire body shaking with violent rage. Her beautiful face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. She shrieked a piercing sound that scraped against the walls. She abandoned any pretense of affection, letting her true vile nature explode into the open air. She turned her venomous gaze toward Brad, screaming that he was nothing but a pathetic, weak coward. She yelled that she completely owned him, that he was simply a useful idiot she had tolerated to gain access to the real wealth hidden within the family. Brad simply shrank further against the fireplace, unable to mount a defense. She had entirely stripped away his manhood in front of his father. Victoria then whipped her head back toward me, her eyes burning with defiance. She pointed a sharp, trembling finger at my chest, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. She screamed that I was nothing but a rotting corpse, taking up valuable space in a world that no longer needed me. She yelled that I was an arrogant old fool who should have died years ago. But even in her rage, she clung desperately to the final shred of her ruined plan. She slapped her hand against the fraudulent power of attorney document. She aggressively insisted that the medical records detailing my severe cognitive decline were already established in the municipal system. She yelled that the documented history of my dementia would completely override anything I tried to say. She believed that her manufactured medical history was an impenetrable shield, guaranteeing that a judge would simply dismiss my accusations as the paranoid delusions of a sick, dying man. She stood there, completely and utterly convinced that she could still manipulate the legal system to secure her prize. She had absolutely no idea that the authorities were not waiting for a courtroom date. Victoria remained standing, her chest heaving with the exertion of her vitriolic outburst. She was certain she had won, convinced her fabricated medical records and ruthless willpower were an impenetrable shield against my accusations. She glared at me, waiting for me to crumble under her perceived invincibility. But I did not crumble or shrink back into my armchair. I held her furious gaze with a look of profound, chilling serenity. Slowly, I lowered my right hand to the wooden frame of the side table resting against my chair. My fingers traced the smooth edge until they found the small panic button David had wired into the security system 3 days prior. I pressed the button, firmly holding it down for 2 entire seconds. For a brief, suspended moment, nothing happened. Victoria let out a harsh scoff, opening her mouth to hurl another barrage of insults at me. but the words never materialized. Instead, the solid oak double doors leading into my private study unlatched with a loud click. The doors smoothly slid apart, recessing into the walls, and the calculated silence of the living room was instantly shattered. 4 men stepped out of the shadows of my study and walked onto the living room carpet. Leading the formation was Mitch Gallagher, his face a mask of cold, legal fury. Flanking him was the local chief of police wearing a dark uniform and an expression of absolute disgust. Behind them were 2 federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical body armor, their eyes scanning the room with predatory efficiency. They had been standing in the darkness of my study for 30 minutes, listening to the live audio feed, absorbing every threatening word Victoria had screamed into the hidden microphones. The sudden, overwhelming presence of law enforcement instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Victoria froze completely, her mouth hanging open in a silent gasp of total disbelief. The absolute certainty that fueled her rage evaporated into the cold reality of her immediate destruction. Brad let out a pathetic whimper, his knees finally giving out entirely. He slid down the fireplace, collapsing into a miserable heap on the floor, burying his face in his trembling hands. He knew it was over. Mitch walked toward the glass coffee table, completely ignoring Brad and Victoria. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick document bound in a red medical folder. He tossed the folder onto the glass surface next to the $45 million ranch appraisal and the broken pieces of the brass pen. The word toxicology was printed across the top in bold black letters. Mitch looked directly at Victoria, his voice dripping with pure contempt. He told her that her medical records were absolutely worthless. He explained that the federal task force had already secured the laboratory results, detailing the exact chemical composition of the benzodiazepines she had been secretly feeding me. He informed her that the hidden cameras had captured her tampering with my medication in high-definition video, creating an undeniable chain of physical evidence. The local police chief stepped forward, his boots thudding against the floorboards. He looked at Victoria, his voice booming through the quiet house with the absolute authority of the law. He formally announced that she was being placed under immediate arrest. He explicitly listed the charges, letting each severe felony sink into her mind like a heavy stone. He stated she was being charged with aggravated felony elder abuse, attempted chemical poisoning, and massive conspiracy to commit wire fraud across state lines. He told her federal agents were concurrently raiding her business office in downtown Denver, seizing her computer's financial records and every digital footprint connecting her to the $3 million shadow syndicate. Victoria stared at the police chief, her eyes wide, completely unable to process the total and instantaneous collapse of her entire world. She had believed she was the smartest person in the room, the master manipulator orchestrating a flawless, undetectable crime. Now, she was staring directly at a mountain of federal indictments that would ensure she never saw the outside of a prison cell again. The chief then turned his hard gaze toward Brad, informing my weeping son that he was being charged as a willing accessory to attempted murder and financial fraud. Brad did not even try to defend himself. He simply continued to sob into his hands, a pathetic, broken shell of a man who had traded his father's life for a fleeting illusion of safety. While the police chief continued to read the formal Miranda rights, Arthur Vance finally realized the catastrophic severity of his situation. The disgraced notary had spent the last 5 minutes standing frozen near the foyer, his mind desperately calculating a way to escape the room. When the federal agents stepped forward to secure the perimeter, Arthur panicked. He dropped his battered leather satchel onto the floor, turned on his heel, and sprinted toward the heavy mahogany front door. He did not make it past the entryway console. One of the federal agents moved with terrifying explosive speed. He crossed the living room in 3 massive strides, lunging forward and tackling the fleeing fraudster directly to the hardwood floor. The impact was violent and incredibly loud. Arthur crashed into the wood, the breath knocked completely out of his lungs. The agent effortlessly pinned the older man's arms behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of the cuffs locking into place echoed brightly through the house. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of total defeat. Victoria snapped out of her paralyzed shock at the sound of the violent tackle. The federal agent nearest to her stepped forward, reaching for his own set of steel restraints. As he grasped her upper arm to pull her hands behind her back, her sweet, calculating facade shattered completely. The polished, arrogant real estate broker vanished, replaced by a desperate, trapped predator. She began to struggle, twisting her body and screaming at the top of her lungs. Her shrieks were no longer filled with superiority or cruel manipulation. They were wild, panicked, animalistic screams of pure terror. She yelled that she had not done anything wrong, that it was all a massive misunderstanding, that the syndicate was going to kill her if she went to jail. The federal agent ignored her frantic pleas entirely. He forced her wrists together, locking the cold steel cuffs tightly against her skin. She thrashed wildly, her expensive designer coat tearing at the seam, her perfectly styled hair falling across her face in chaotic, desperate strands. She screamed that she was not going to a federal prison, that she demanded a lawyer, that she refused to be locked away. But her frantic words meant absolutely nothing. The trap I had carefully constructed had snapped perfectly shut. I sat comfortably in my leather armchair, resting my steady hands on my knees, watching with absolute profound satisfaction as the law enforcement officers dragged the screaming, flailing woman and my weeping, pathetic son completely out of my home, out of my life, and directly into the inescapable, crushing reality of their permanent destruction. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel cuffs locking around Victoria's wrists seemed to echo endlessly against the high ceilings of my living room. As the federal agent stepped back, maintaining a firm grip on her arms, the reality of her inescapable doom finally penetrated her frantic, desperate mind. The color completely drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving a pale, terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She was no longer a sophisticated real estate broker plotting a lucrative corporate acquisition. She was a trapped, cornered animal facing the absolute destruction of her entire existence. The local police chief stood firmly in the center of the room, reading her the formal Miranda rights in a deep, monotonous voice that contrasted sharply with her chaotic panic. He systematically listed her fundamental rights, but Victoria was not listening to a single word of the legal warning. Her wide, frantic eyes darted around the room, searching for a viable escape, a lifeline, or a convenient scapegoat. Her gaze inevitably landed on my son. Brad was still slumped against the heavy oak mantel of the fireplace, trembling uncontrollably, his face buried deep within his shaking hands. The sight of his complete, pathetic collapse seemed to ignite a massive, explosive reservoir of hatred deep within her chest. Victoria violently jerked against the restraining grip of the federal agent, turning the full, devastating force of her fury directly onto her new husband. She did not ask him for help. She did not seek comfort from the man she had sworn to love. Instead, she viciously tore him apart with a barrage of incredibly cruel, emasculating insults. Her voice was a harsh, scraping shriek that practically vibrated the glass on the coffee table. She cursed him with a vile, deeply personal hatred, screaming that he was nothing but a pathetic, spineless loser who had completely ruined everything. She yelled that she had orchestrated a flawless, brilliant financial maneuver, and all he had to do was successfully manage one broken, clueless old man, but his fundamental weakness had sabotaged the entire operation. She openly mocked his cowardice loudly, declaring to the entire room that she had only married him for his proximity to my wealth, viewing him as nothing more than a convenient, easily manipulated stepping stone to her ultimate financial salvation. She shrieked that his profound inability to control his own father was the exact reason they were now facing federal prison. Her words were meticulously designed to inflict maximum psychological damage, stripping away every single layer of his dignity right in front of the law enforcement officers and his own father. The federal agents finally pulled her forcefully toward the foyer, dragging her struggling, furious body out the front door. But her shrill, hateful screams continued to pierce the quiet suburban air until they firmly shut the heavy mahogany door behind her. The sudden silence that settled over the living room was incredibly dense, suffocating, and heavy with the aftermath of her explosive departure. The illusion of their perfect, loving partnership had been violently shattered into microscopic fragments. Mitch Gallagher stood quietly near the window, his arms crossed over his tailored suit, watching the scene unfold with grim professional satisfaction. The police chief signaled to his remaining officers, slowly turning his attention toward the pathetic figure still cowering by the fireplace. Brad slowly lowered his trembling hands from his face. His skin was slick with cold sweat, his eyes red and swollen from shedding tears of pure, unadulterated fear. He stared at the closed front door, realizing that the brilliant, commanding woman who had promised him an effortless life of immense luxury had just publicly eviscerated him and left him completely alone to face the catastrophic consequences of their shared conspiracy. He looked at the armed federal agents, and then finally, he turned his terrified, weeping eyes toward me. He pushed himself away from the cold brick of the fireplace, stumbling awkwardly across the thick carpet. He moved with a pathetic, desperate lack of coordination, practically dragging his body across the floor until he collapsed heavily onto his knees directly in front of my leather armchair. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands, desperately trying to grasp the fabric of my trousers. He looked up at me, his face contorted in a mask of total hysterical panic. He began to beg, stringing together a chaotic, frantic series of cowardly excuses and desperate pleas for mercy. He claimed that he never truly wanted to hurt me, insisting that Victoria had systematically brainwashed him with her manipulative lies. He cried that she had poisoned his mind, twisting his thoughts until he genuinely believed I was a burden to myself. Then the underlying truth of his terror finally spilled out. He confessed his absolute fear of the unregulated shadow syndicate. He sobbed uncontrollably, explaining that Victoria's aggressive creditors were violent, unpredictable criminals who had explicitly threatened to destroy their lives if the $3 million debt was not immediately satisfied. He begged me to understand the crushing, impossible pressure he had been operating under. He tried to frame his horrific betrayal as a desperate, misguided attempt to protect his family from physical harm. He swore that he still loved me, pleading with me to use my influence with Mitch and the authorities to stop the prosecution. He promised he would sign a full confession, testify against Victoria, and do absolutely whatever it took to fix the massively fractured relationship between a father and his son. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the trembling man kneeling on my carpet. I did not pull my leg away from his desperate, grasping hands. I did not raise my voice, nor did I feel the sudden explosive surge of anger that had consumed me just an hour ago. The raging fire in my chest had completely burned out, leaving behind a desolate landscape of absolute emptiness. I looked at his familiar features, searching for the innocent boy I had raised. But that boy was completely gone, entirely erased by the pathetic coward currently begging for his freedom. I felt no parental warmth, no lingering instinct to protect him from the harsh consequences of his calculated actions. I felt nothing but a profound, icy, and permanent disappointment. I leaned forward slightly, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. My voice was a flat whisper, entirely devoid of measurable human emotion. I told him his pathetic excuses meant absolutely nothing to me. I explained that greed is an understandable failing, a common sin that can occasionally be forgiven. But cowardice, the conscious decision to sacrifice your own flesh and blood to save yourself from danger, is an irreversible rot of the soul. I told him he handed the knife to my executioner because he was terrified to face his own problems. I paused, letting the cold reality of my words settle over his weeping frame. I spoke the final truth, ensuring it would echo in his mind for the rest of his miserable life. I told him your mother was right to hide her legacy from you. Your cowardice is far more disgusting than her greed. You are no son of mine. The words struck him with the blunt force of a physical blow. Brad recoiled violently, his hands dropping from my knees, as if the fabric of my trousers had suddenly caught fire. He rocked back onto his heels, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish suffocating on a dry dock. He was searching for a magical combination of words that could somehow rewind the clock, a desperate apology that could miraculously undo the profound treachery he had just willingly participated in. But no such words existed. The absolute finality of my rejection hung in the quiet space between us, cold and heavy as a granite tombstone. I watched his eyes dart frantically around the empty living room, seeking any possible anchor in a reality that was rapidly disintegrating beneath his feet. He looked toward the front door, where his wife had just been dragged away in steel restraints, then back to the glass coffee table, where the physical evidence of their massive criminal conspiracy remained displayed. He was completely unmoored, finally facing the devastating consequences of his own calculated greed. I did not offer him a moment to collect his shattered thoughts. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of my leather chair and pushed myself up to a standing position. I towered over his pathetic, weeping figure, casting a long shadow across the expensive carpet. I told him that my profound disappointment in his character was not the only consequence he was going to face today. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion, delivering the facts with the clinical precision of a surgeon amputating a necrotic limb. I reminded him of the lavish, upscale home he shared with Victoria in the exclusive Lincoln Park district. I watched a flicker of confusion cross his tear-stained face as I mentioned the property. He still foolishly believed that despite the criminal charges, he possessed some modicum of a safety net, a comfortable harbor where he could hide while the legal storms raged around his wife. I systematically shattered that final pathetic illusion. I informed him that exactly 3 days ago, while he was busy coordinating with Victoria to secretly drug my coffee and steal my grandfathered water rights, I was sitting in a secure conference room with my financial attorneys. I told him that I had officially and permanently withdrawn my status as the primary financial guarantor on his extravagant Lincoln Park mortgage. I watched the blood drain completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent white. He understood the immediate gravity of my statement. His entire lifestyle, the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the multi-million-dollar mortgage had been entirely predicated on the quiet, steady strength of my personal credit and my silent financial backing. I explained the mechanics of his impending doom with deliberate, unhurried clarity. I told him that without my name anchoring the massive debt, the bank had immediately triggered an emergency review of his personal financial standing. I reminded him that his own income was woefully insufficient to maintain the staggering monthly payments on that beautiful property. Then I delivered the absolute killing blow. I reminded him of the federal agents currently raiding Victoria's downtown brokerage firm. I explicitly laid out the reality of federal conspiracy charges and racketeering statutes. I told him that every single bank account, investment portfolio, and liquid asset associated with Victoria had already been completely frozen by the federal government under strict asset forfeiture laws. I carefully explained that she was currently penniless, and by direct extension, so was he. I watched his mind violently struggle to process the catastrophic convergence of these events. I told him that the bank was fully aware of the federal investigation and the subsequent asset freeze, because he no longer possessed a solvent cosigner, and because his primary household income was now completely locked behind federal seals. The bank had already initiated immediate aggressive action. I leaned down slightly, making sure he heard every single syllable of my next sentence. I told him that the formal foreclosure notices were already drafted and would be physically nailed to his front door tomorrow morning. He was not just losing his manipulative wife to a federal penitentiary. He was losing his home, his social standing, and every single material possession he had cowardly attempted to protect. I watched the realization of his total, inescapable ruin crash over him like a suffocating tidal wave. He had gambled his soul for a $45 million inheritance, and the resulting loss had stripped him of absolutely everything. The lucrative Colorado ranch he had plotted to steal was entirely out of reach, safely protected in an ironclad trust. The wealthy, sophisticated wife who had promised him an empire of ease was currently sitting in the back of an armored federal transport vehicle. The beautiful home he used to project an image of effortless success was already lost to the bank, and the father he had callously offered up as a sacrificial lamb was standing before him, completely severing their familial bond for the rest of eternity. Brad collapsed entirely. He folded his body against the hardwood floor, curling his knees up toward his chest, in a fetal position of profound, unadulterated misery. His weeping devolved into harsh, ragged gasps that shook his entire frame. He clawed at the carpet with his trembling fingers, burying his face into the thick fibers as he cried out into the empty room. He was mourning the absolute death of his comfortable, sheltered existence. He was grieving the catastrophic consequences of his own pathetic weakness. He had willingly chosen to align himself with a predator, naively believing he could safely ride in her wake while she devoured his family. Now the predator was caged, and he was left completely exposed, bankrupt, and utterly alone in a harsh, unforgiving world he was fundamentally unequipped to navigate. I stood over him for one final minute, watching his body heave with the violent force of his despair. I searched my heart for a single drop of pity, a lingering trace of the fatherly instinct to reach down and comfort my broken child. But the well was completely dry. The man sobbing on the floor was a stranger who had plotted to steal my life. I had no comfort left to offer him. I turned my back on his wretched display. I walked away from the center of the living room, leaving the broken brass pen and the fraudulent legal documents resting on the glass table as a permanent monument to their failed treachery. The sound of his pathetic sobbing echoed behind me as I walked down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. I entered my room and walked directly to the large oak armoire. I reached into the bottom drawer, pulling out a simple dark canvas duffel bag. I packed a few comfortable clothes, my sturdy boots, and my small toiletry kit. I did not take any sentimental keepsakes or old family photographs. That life was permanently over. I zipped the heavy bag closed and hoisted it securely over my shoulder. My work in this dark place was entirely finished. It has been exactly 1 full month since the heavy mahogany door of my home clicked shut behind Victoria. The frantic, desperate chaos of that afternoon has finally settled into a cold, orderly legal process. She is currently sitting in a sterile federal holding facility, entirely stripped of her expensive designer clothes and her arrogant delusions, nervously awaiting a massive federal trial that will inevitably end with a decades-long prison sentence. The violent shadow syndicate she so foolishly tried to appease was completely dismantled by the Joint Task Force just 3 days after her highly publicized arrest. Every single digital footprint, every fraudulent bank transfer, and every piece of counterfeit documentation she created was meticulously cataloged by the relentless authorities. Her entire world, built entirely on lies, malicious deception, and ruthless manipulation, collapsed with absolute devastating finality. She will spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a concrete cell, paying the ultimate price for underestimating a man she deemed worthless. Brad is completely cut off from my life. After the bank immediately foreclosed on their lavish Lincoln Park estate, he was unceremoniously evicted by armed county sheriffs. He is now living in a cheap, rundown motel on the dreary industrial outskirts of the city, struggling to comprehend how his incredibly privileged life imploded so rapidly. He has attempted to call my secure burner phone dozens of times, leaving pathetic, weeping voicemails begging for a second chance, pleading for financial salvation, and claiming he is a victim of circumstance. I listen to absolutely none of them. I simply delete the desperate messages and immediately block the new numbers. My profound disappointment in him has hardened into a permanent icy resolve. He cowardly chose his dark path, and now he must walk it alone, completely devoid of my financial protection and paternal love. I am currently sitting in the worn driver's seat of my reliable old work truck, gripping the steering wheel as the powerful engine hums reassuringly beneath the hood. I am driving steadily down the open interstate highway, watching the dense gray skyline of the city slowly fade into nothingness in the rearview mirror. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had been cruelly crushing my chest for weeks has finally lifted, entirely replaced by a deep, profound sense of absolute peace. I reach over and turn up the volume on the dashboard radio, letting a familiar, comforting country melody fill the quiet cabin. The miles roll by, bringing me closer to my true sanctuary. Through the dusty windshield, the towering, majestic peaks of the Colorado mountains slowly come into view, their brilliant, snow-capped summits piercing the clear, vibrant blue sky. I am finally heading home. I am heading directly to Carolyn's beautiful ranch, not to sell it to greedy developers or liquidate her grandfather's precious water rights, but to live on it in absolute, undisturbed peace. The $45 million is completely secure, safely locked within an ironclad, irrevocable trust foundation specifically designed to financially support elderly victims of domestic abuse and corporate fraud. I roll down the window, letting the crisp, fresh mountain air wash over my weathered face. I take a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the pure scent of pine and absolute freedom. My terrible nightmare is entirely finished. I am finally, truly free. The tires hum against the asphalt as I climb higher into the familiar elevation. I vividly remember the day Carolyn and I first stood on that expansive porch, looking out over the endless acres of untamed wilderness. We had promised each other that our sacred land would forever remain a safe haven, entirely protected from the ravenous greed of the outside world. I am returning to honor that solemn vow. The vast sweeping valleys and dense pine forests are waiting to welcome me back. I am leaving the deception behind and driving straight into my new beginning. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and integrity make you family. I spent years believing that providing financial security was enough to earn my son's respect. But true character is revealed only when money is on the line. I learned that ignoring red flags to keep the peace only gives parasites the time they need to sharpen their knives. You cannot buy love, and you cannot fix a weak man's spine. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is having the brutal courage to cut the dead weight loose, protect your legacy, and walk away with your head held high. Have you ever been deeply betrayed by someone you sacrificed absolutely everything for? How did you find the strength to walk away? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories about surviving betrayal and taking back your life.